but the bodies of their sons, they keep falling. The echoes from Mount Zion.
Kind of makes me want to scrap the whole thing. Kind of just do a tech podcast.
We should just talk about which spreadsheet.
Which spreadsheets are the best?
Yeah,
Is there even a debate about that? It's Excel.
I know. Have you seen that Jared Taylor, old Jared Taylor YouTube?
No.
Oh, you got to see that. It's like,
Oh yeah, I sent it to the camp.
yeah,
What?
It's hilarious. It's like Jared Taylor when he's in his 30s or something. Basically speaking with the same vehement rhetoric as he would the white race, but he's talking about various forms of spreadsheets.
Is it like in his prior business career or something?
Yeah.
Wow. I'm gonna have to find that.
yeah, it's hysterical. Oh, it's actually in the camp. Just scroll back about a week.
Oh, okay.
You'll find it.
But anyway, the state of the alt-right. Let's talk about it.
I vote Wyoming.
For our new destination?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not a bad idea. It seems like my dad and I are actually watching this interesting documentary series about this cult leader in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And they chose Oregon.
Oh, yeah.
As their essential ethno-city that they created.
For obvious reasons.
Well, yeah, there were no blacks there.
They actually weren't white.
No.
Oh, they weren't. What were they?
It was a Hindu.
Other?
Yeah.
They were other.
Non-Hispanic.
A lot of them were white, but the cult leader was a heretical Hindu named Osho.
But yeah, it seemed like part of the reason they did that is because the land there was so cheap. Also, they have I don't know if it's only in the state of Oregon, but they were talking about some law that applied specifically to the state of Oregon that allows for over, I think it's 150 people can decide to basically build a state around them. They can, or a city or something. They can have legal rights to the land around them.
And this was only 50 years ago?
Well, no, less than 50 years ago. It was
1981 when they started.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow. We may have to look into that rule.
Yeah.
So since I kind of came up with this question, I'll preface where I was coming at it from. I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit. I know we have spoken about this a little bit, but to really dig into where the alt-right is, and then especially just in terms of the kind of defined mainstream movement, primarily based around Richard and his posse, and what they need to do going forward, what we need to do going forward, what the different paths are, what the different kind of outcomes are, things like that. That was kind of my vision of where this conversation could start, at least.
That sounds great. One of the first obvious subtopics to discuss would be the optics question.
Definitely. With our Heimbach debacle. Right,
with the Heimbach debacle, and
I feel like we could combine those two words.
Heimbacher. It's going to become a term. He really Heimbachled that one.
At that point, you could just say Heimbached, though.
Yeah, the real Heimbacher.
Heimbacher, I hardly knew her.
You hardly knew her. It was your damn mother-in-law.
Oh, the kid Matthew.
Yeah, not to counter signal Matthew so hard. I'm gonna assume Richard's role for a moment and try and set some parameters.
You're going to be the goody two-shoe mother character?
Yeah, exactly.
Are you going to speak in voice?
In Richard's voice, is that what you said?
Yeah. Soften your T's.
Right. Other than that, I'm not sure how I can emulate him. But yeah,
You got to say no a lot.
no.
No.
Is that what we're going to do? No.
Jack, did I just hear you cough?
It's
I am smoking cigarettes inside, so it's possible.
We've got cough drops.
we're
Seriously, Greg.
All right, but seriously, the optics question seems like a good prelude to the greater discussion on the direction of the movement, because that is a hot topic amongst, figureheads and the alt-right military, so to speak, infantry right now, that, people like Greg Johnson, Jared Taylor, Identity Europa, they clearly, James Alsop, I suppose, they clearly have cemented themselves into the corner of somewhat counter-signaling the optics even that Richard is expressing.
Mm-hmm.
And then...
Which is interesting. I would also cut in and say, I don't know that is necessarily optics. That's almost more like, because they're not really talking about how they're presenting themselves. They're talking literally about
their actions.
Yeah. They're kind of counter-signaling like almost the ethno-state, I guess, or some deeper actual meaning behind the movement is kind of my view of it. Whereas when we're talking about optics, we're thinking of TWP versus, what Richard tries to present.
Right. I guess I'm also including in optics, which might be.
Why don't we just let's get into that in a second. Let's start with optics and kind of bring Virgil, because we had a brief conversation. So let's bring Virgil up to date on what we had talked about following the Heinbockel. So, Virgil, kind of one of our ideas about starting even this podcast was thinking of trying to form some sort of, of move or subset of the movement that could appeal to, people who were not working class people, I guess, or whatever you would, the Workers' Party people who didn't want to necessarily be associated with sort of poverty and lashing out against a system that is crushing them, but people who are, successful leaders regardless of what's going on, but still looking for a better way forward. And so that's kind of, I was kind of taking, I guess, a hard stand on that. I can't remember exactly what your position was on this, but that it is pretty unappealing to be associated with, something like the TWP is the best example.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it's not at all really to do with their views either. It's just the way that they enact their views in too far down a neo-Nazi vein, with it's just not appealing, not only to people who are, I guess, intellectuals within the movement, that are taking these things more seriously, people who are also counter-signaling Richard for that matter. But also to the greater, to prospective alt-right candidates deliberating whether or not they want to, maybe civic nationalists or people like Paul Mellon, if his only view of the alt-right had been the TWP, it's possible that, well, first of all, he wouldn't be communicating with people like Kevin McDonald, or I think Richard even mentioned in one of his podcasts that he had a conversation with Paul. Am I remembering that incorrectly? I think he said they at least exchanged a few emails or Twitter messages or so. That wouldn't be an accessible, TWP or Vanguard and some of these more just heavily Nazified movements wouldn't be a niche that would probably be appealing to someone like Nellen.
Sure, and even beyond that, but getting back to the pure optics of it too, just the fact that they are, I mean, kind of self-proclaimed lower class, right? It's like
Right.
they're probably not a group of 130 plus IQ people. They're living, in the Appalachian Hills or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, I think it's clearly a better presentation to have conferences and hold, peaceful demonstrations or rallies, and look the part of a, well-to-do, at least someone who can provide for their family, a virtuous man or woman, which is why Ameren has like dress codes and things like that. I think
Sure.
all
Well,
that's
I counter signal the women providing for their families connotation, but
women providing for their families. I never said that.
okay, I misheard then. But anyway, to bring it
Providing nutrition for their families,
there we go.
certainly.
I mean, milk is fine.
no, that's the one provision.
Sorry, I was puffing on my pipe.
Yeah, it was good. So I guess Virgil, kind of like, since we haven't really spoken this explicitly about this aspect of it, it'd be interesting to hear kind of because also with the context that, Richard's big next power move is annexing the Bernie Bros. So thinking about appealing to the more mainstream or normal type individuals, you're going to need some branch or undercurrent of people who have sort of more of that like sex appeal type of, thing going on, as opposed to these sort of angry, because you can pretty easily paint TWP as like just angry poor people.
Right. I mean, this is a complicated issue because I've sort of seen this. This is this sort of coming down the line because the alt-right, it's very difficult to unite an intellectual movement with kind of a working class movement. It almost takes someone in between. I think that person has emerged that can possibly. That's kind of one of the
Toe the line.
Well, I just like can appeal to both ends. People like Richard Spencer and any of the other what I would call leaders of the alt-right, like Jared Taylor and Kevin McDonald and even Greg Johnson, they're intellectuals. That's why they're appealing to me. But to have a bigger movement that can somehow gain political power has to appeal to, regular, I don't mean normies, I just mean regular white nationalists with everyday problems. And if you look back in the 30s and 40s fascist movements, people like Codrianu and Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco, they were all able to, because of their life experience, were able to appeal to a much broader spectrum of society because of their experience, and it could just be that people were a little bit more homogenous in that sense, that the working class people weren't psychologically so far away from so-called educated class, whereas we seem to be more fragmented in that way.
Specifically in the movement?
Not necessarily the movement, but just in our society.
Mm.
And, probably, in the movement, I'm sure too, like the white nationalist 1.0, I've heard that referred to as like the skinheads. And
right.
To me, that's, just completely uninteresting. But those people still exist. And those are the kind of people that would and maybe are part of the Traditionalist Workers' Party.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Where I think that it seems to me like in 1930s Romania that these two groups of people weren't so far apart psychologically as they are in 2018. And that makes it complicates things a great deal, because those people are absolutely needed for any kind of political movement because they can vote.
Right. I mean, I guess what you're describing is essentially the Traditionalist Workers' Party, but barring, such low expressions of how they present themselves.
Yes, I guess maybe what this is just me thinking completely off the cuff, is like the way that someone like Codreanu and Hitler were able to appeal to a much broader segment of societies, because they themselves weren't really from the intellectual class.
Mm.
Even though they were intellectuals, they, Hitler fought in World War I, and Codreanu, in fact, was involved in military conflict as well. They just gave them a kind of sympathy for the working class.
Right.
Even though fairly naturally part of it, it's because they were regal figures. They had sympathy for it. In fact, traditionally the king always appealed far more to the peasantry than he did to any intellectual class. Somehow the king always fully represented those people. And in the alt-right, there's a real lack of someone like that in terms of leadership, that for whatever reason, like if you look at somehow Trump was able to appeal to regular people more than any Republican I can think of in recent history, even though he's a billionaire, or supposedly a billionaire. And I think that's just because he was involved in building things and rubbed shoulders constantly with drywallers and people like that. He knew them and he sympathized with them, and he could appeal to them at their level. And in the alt-right, we have, for various reasons, I like all of these people, but these intellectual arguments and so on aren't necessarily going to appeal to drywallers who also have a sense of their own people and want to do something.
So kind of the question from that kind of ties into the overall direction is, how time sensitive or necessary is it to unify, or can these kind of separate factions move along and grow in strength in parallel while we wait for, Paul Mellon or someone of his ilk to bring it into the full mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, from what Virgil was just saying, it sounded like for someone to be able to appeal to the masses in that kind of way, like in a political run, a political campaign, it would take someone of the Trumpian realm that can appeal that way to those people without simply being, only an intellectual, only someone immersed in literature and books and the kind of higher thought permeating the alt-right.
Right. I mean, I agree with that. That makes sense. But just in terms of where we're at right now, is that does that person need to emerge soon, or can we, be fine sitting back and having this somewhat fractured movement?
Well, I don't think we can be fine with it, but I think that's where we are. I think it's important to, or as Richard would say, it's important to understand where we are. And the alt-right is a fractured movement. And that's inevitable in a way because of how much because of the enemies of the alt-right. I mean, it's more difficult now than probably at any time for the alt-right to gain a foothold in any area. So it's inevitable that with that kind of onslaught of the enemies that the movement is fractured. And it's just going to take, I think it's just going to take time for new leaders to emerge, for political developments to occur that provide a path forward.
Yeah, and like those gentlemen were saying in their second to last podcast discussing TWP, even though the leadership of that movement appears to be fractured, if not somewhat non-existent, I don't know what Heimbach is doing, but it seems that Parrott has left the movement. There are still enclaves of those individuals in some kind of community throughout the nation, is the way they were speaking about it, which, those people need a new leader. And if someone like Richard or people that he associates himself with aren't those leaders, which, an argument can be made that they have the potential to be. I don't think that Richard is living in this world where he could never appeal to the lower class individuals. He talks about industrialization of the alt-right and these plans moving forward and bringing more people into a real life gathering place and a real life community. None of that would be possible without the hordes of individuals existing in these factions, like Jack was saying, to come forward and participate. To reference that documentary about the Rajneesh again, obviously, they built a city out in the middle of nowhere in Oregon, and they were only able to do so. They had clearly had a whole onslaught of highly educated intellectuals working with them, like engineers and architects and electricians, people that knew how to really create everything that went into a city, and the foundations of it. But the labor itself would obviously need to be there. So, the more people, the better, in my opinion. And I don't, obviously they can't all participate in the directional, political direction of the movement itself. But you can participate in a real way, if there was a way to do so, when there comes a day that the greater alt-right is able to gather together and with a one sole focus in mind of expanding and building the movement. That's really what needs to happen. I think there needs to be nationwide unity to really grasp the movement and how many individuals are actually empathizing, if not, tenaciously wanting to participate.
Yeah, John, I think that's a great point. I think I actually fully agree with you. It's kind
Finally.
I think it's, I do love to counter signal. As an aside, I've started using counter signal for disagree in normal society, and it's super confusing to people.
Yeah, I have too.
But, it's fine. So, like, the perfect example of this is Nick Fuentes, who I kind of, I had a month or two there where I was listening to his show and following him and everything. And so we have these people like him who are fully on board with the agenda for the most part. Enough, right? Like, they're close enough. But they have this vision of, I guess they're overly white pilling, and they think that they can make a difference on the margin and try to steer the country back on course. Kind of like closer to a, just a Trumpian. Like, we got excited about Trump because he's directionally correct despite not embodying our beliefs. And so they basically then position themselves as an opposition to the mainstream of the alt-right movement. And so we have these people that are, some of it I'm sure is, branding and doing whatever they want to do. But I think that in his case, I would give him the benefit of the doubt and think he thinks he's doing what is right in setting himself up as kind of this more mainstream nationalist type person, as opposed to, as we're talking about here, kind of consolidating the movement and having the movement be something as opposed to just the ideas behind it.
Right. A real life entity.
Right. Like, you agree with everything we're saying, but you won't be a part of it.
Yeah. That's one of the biggest reasons that it's terribly hard for complete unification at the moment, is because, you have groups like TWP that are totally and courageously willing to participate and, appear to have no negative thoughts about whether or not they're going to be doxxed. But the vast majority of the movement, you can't even gauge the level of in which they're willing to participate because they remain completely anonymous, and therefore, no unification can occur. Except in the cyber realm,
right? That's kind of a separate issue. The unification and people being anonymous. Yes, unification would be more possible if everyone was out in the open, but that's a much bigger hurdle than just getting, some level of directional unification, because it's going to be a while before people are able to come out in the open.
Yeah.
You can't even be out in the open
as a Trump
supporter.
Right.
And I can speak to personal experience. Like, my direct boss is a hardcore feminist, and my coworker is a gay. And fortunately, is that right? Do you say a gay?
Yeah, I think that's right.
They want to be referred to as a gay.
It takes away a little bit of their humanity.
Yes. When he came out to us, I said, "Oh, so you're a gay?" But even obviously playing it close to the shirt politically, because I wasn't pro, this giant, pro oppression, I guess, and this whole dichotomy they live in where, people like us are oppressing them. That was like a negative, even without being explicitly pro-Trump. And once I realized the setting, lying about it, still not coming out as yeah, this is awful.
Right.
Is like, that hurts in and of itself. And we're talking like 5 degrees removed from, the ethno state.
Right, or even 5 degrees removed from what we actually think on a daily basis.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean, we're in a situation where in some places, and weirdly, I think it's probably most of the country, if you do not say you hate Trump, you're considered a little bit suspect.
Oh, I have a great anecdote here. So I deviated from my high-end barber that I've been going to, and I went to a local cheap, crappy place. And so I went in there, and this guy is fully tatted up and is just the goofiest person I've ever met, is cutting my hair, and he's trying way too hard to make conversation.
No, I hate
and
that.
It was like super awkward. Oh yeah, to provide some more context, he said, "By the way, my girlfriend proposed to me last night." seemed totally proud of it. This guy's like 6 feet tall, weighs 120 pounds. Regardless, but he's one of these guys that's trying to be as friendly as possible, just asking me questions, and just the thing that came to his head is just like something we could bond over. As he says, "Yeah, man, especially in this economy, I've noticed that as the president gets dumber, things get more expensive." And I was like, "Well, you're the one with the scissors, so I'm going to agree with you."
It sounds like he might have been Antifa that you got your hair cut by. 120-pound, 6-foot guy with tatted up.
I don't know why I'm just realizing that.
Definitely don't go back there.
Point being, though, that it's just the mainstream discourse is just so you can totally say that whenever you want.
That's true. I mean, people just could be anywhere that you're living. Whether it's I won't. Whatever, Minnesota, anywhere that you are, people assume they can bash the president, even though ostensibly half the nation voted for him.
Yeah,
I'd love to exist in that mindset.
I think the ostensibly you threw in there is hearkening to the Russian bots that may have voted for him.
Right. Well, also the fact that the majority of the nation didn't even vote. So, I mean, if everyone was forced to vote, I'm not. Who knows?
For sure.
Everyone except the blacks. I mean, if everyone who was legally eligible to vote, obviously that takes away 80% of the black population.
Felons.
Virgil, I think
are you thinking like 1789 legal or?
Well, I'm talking about the fact that so many African Americans don't go through the legal process of being eligible to vote.
Oh,
and they don't have identification. If you're too stupid to get an ID, you shouldn't be able to vote.
Right. If you can't figure out how to get identification, I mean, to me, that is like a real bare bones basic requirement.
I mean, honestly, what am I misremembering the Democrat who won the seat in Alabama, Doug Jones? That's not the new Nazi who's campaigning in Illinois?
No, Doug Jones is right.
Okay, Doug Jones.
Is there a Nazi in Illinois?
Oh yeah.
Oh no, I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
Holocaust denier. He actually doesn't call himself a Nazi.
Well, that's counter-signaling.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, he was the president of the American Nazi Party.
he's kind of doing a whole David Duke back up here.
Good cop, bad cop. Virgil, I've been thinking it would be worth it to recount the conversation we had, I think yesterday, about the discussion between George Lincoln Rockwell and William Pierce.
Yeah.
Going back into that conversation about optics and, how people relating to particular directions. I think that's a good example. If not, it's a good example of, I guess, what we're trying to overcome, essentially.
Well, it's part of the same conversation in the sense that the only way that George Lincoln Rockwell was able to get any traction at all was to be intentionally provocative. I mean, he was saying that he tried for a while to kind of appeal to normies and this was, in the 1950s and 60s, with just, dressing normally, saying kind of normal things, edgy things, but, not too far to the right. Touch on the race question and so on. He noted that people would come up to him after a speech and say they agreed, but they couldn't possibly openly embrace his ideas in actual life. And it wasn't until he started wearing Nazi regalia that he actually had a following. But Pierce's issue is that his following was just a bunch of kind of insane losers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's completely the problem of the Traditional Workers' Party. It's the same scenario, is that we have been, as a society, we've been just so completely co-opted that we literally can't move and breathe without fear of financial destruction, so forth.
Yeah. At the same time, though, there's a line that can be drawn between complete and utter filth and being a loser, and simply a white individual with a let's say 100 IQ. Is that too low? I mean, there needs to be a position for them as well. Otherwise, you're
I guess
depriving yourself of a large demographic who could potentially. Sorry, go ahead.
I think maybe one thing to consider is that those folks, the salt of the earth kind of people living out in the world, they will, if the alt-right were to somehow garnish some kind of political power, some kind of post-destruction or financial collapse or whatever scenario occurred that would allow for that kind of thing to happen.
Again, I just think it would take complete unification. But go on.
That those people we don't need to appeal to those people. In fact, in the meantime, those people will come.
Right.
In the same way that those people voted for Trump. They just believe whatever you say. And if let's say a new leader, let's say it's Richard Spencer, somehow, some way was able to run for president of the alt-right party. Let's say that in 2020, that were somehow a possibility. The people that the Traditionalist Workers' Party is trying to appeal to would vote for him. If he just said, yeah, we're going to make it so that there's going to be a minimum, what is it they call it, universal basic income.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or something like that. He would get the Bernie Bros and he would get those people automatically. So there's really, in a way, there's no reason to concern ourselves with the unification of the so-called lower classes. Because at the moment, in my opinion, the alt-right is an intellectual movement, and it needs to appeal and continue to appeal to it needs to refine its own intellectual arguments and appeal to intellectuals, the movers and shakers of society, the thinkers of society, and if and when it ever has an opportunity to gain political power, that it will at that time easily appeal to those people.
I totally agree.
Yeah, as do I.
Jack's not going to counter signal you.
I think. Well, no. I almost broke in. I was like, by the way, I'm nodding my head vigorously during this. I think that too is like a legitimate possibility, because the people I know that are on the left because, if you're talking about, converting them, so to speak, they're on the left because their identity is wrapped up in intellectual superiority. And if those arguments can, as they gain, I guess, traction, as well as obvious examples as the demographic shift continues, the arguments they're going to be somewhat, they're punk or whatever, but they're going to have more legitimacy, and people are going to gravitate to that.
I mean, it's not, I hear a lot of people say that as our demographic situation gets worse and worse, that more and more people will flood to the movement. It's just not necessarily so. I mean, if you look at the situation in South Africa, they've just given up without a fight. In a way, white people do that. Did Darth Vader join?
Yeah, that's overwhelming.
Did Darth Vader join what?
The podcast.
What
I hear
are you talking about?
Your piping is overwhelming the audio.
Could you?
He joined the podcast and also invented peanut butter.
Virgil, to ask for some, are you talking about the whites in South Africa, or?
Yes, the whites in South Africa that
they're not even standing up for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, right, that they gave up apartheid, right? They the idea that you can give in to these things and expect that the world's going to go, man, that's great, good job, is utter foolishness. I mean, it's the same way with the Southern whites and slavery, and in colonialism, all these things that we eventually gave up on, and yet they weren't necessarily good ideas. I'm not saying that, but once you enslave a people, you better just stick with it, because when you let them go, they're never going to go, yeah, oh, it's fine. There's going to be revenge forever. That's all they're going to seek forever. And we're in that similar situation. Whites mainly don't care about demographic decline. So it's not. I just don't think that that argument, that as this continues to happen, more and more people will flood to the movement, is not necessarily so. I think that more profound intellectual arguments have to be put forth, that it's okay to be white, that our history is not filled with blemishes. Well, Western civilization it's finally the best in the history of humanity.
With the election of Trump and the changing political tides that have come along with him, for better or for worse, someone like John Bolton obviously would be worse. But what's happened, it's not unusual to turn on Fox News. Not that any of us do that, but we just see clips of Tucker Carlson discussing things that are, you could say, like kind of alt-right. Certain things that are incredibly controversial to the mainstream, and thus are reported on in with the same kind of white nationalist Nazi rhetoric as a Richard Spencer speech. But yet still appealing to and possibly educating a large demographic of people who don't have another avenue for these kinds of discussions, that it is okay to be white and that whites are being dispossessed, and that by 2040 we're going to be minority, regardless of less than drastic immigration policy change. And I don't know. I'm not old enough to know if these things have been discussed in a kind of mainstream facet prior to now. But as far as I know, with Trump's kind of civic nationalist brand and the very clearly, it's hard to it's hard to not be at least somewhat aware of the war on whites in America right now.
Now, okay, so I want to push back on this a little bit because this is my main white pill that sustains me. So I would argue that what John just put forth is evidence that, because this wasn't an issue in 1960 for obvious reasons, this is evidence of the demographic shift waking people up. And then also, if you think about an anecdotal example of, the feminist movement fracturing because white women are serious. I mean, this I agree with. Like, they're not oppressed at all. They can't even make that argument. And POC people are coming forward and saying this isn't for you, or that white women who are pro-life or whatever are not part of the movement. So it seems like that fracturing there has to reach a tipping point where people realize that they're not a part of the oppressed minority any longer. They can't say that, oh, I'm a woman, so I'm pro all of this. They're going to say, oh, I am now a white minority or something like that. And so I'm not making a hard argument here, but thinking that the demographic shift is not going to fuel some kind of societal change in consciousness. To me, that's kind of the only way. That's, in my perception, the last hope. So I have to at least kind of deliberate on that for a second.
Yeah, I agree. And to reference something that Virgil often pontificates on is that it would take some sort of economic disaster, downfall of some kind,
World
war, sure, for us to unite, and that would be the easiest way, possibly. But I would like to, and a way that could occur is simply, I hope that it doesn't take this long for the vast majority of whites to wake up and decide to not be so lazy in their dispossession, so lazy and apathetic to their clear dispossession. When that happens, race is real, race matters, and race is the foundation of identity. When that happens, our whiteness will be what defines us. And regardless of, I feel these certain things about liberalism are accurate or whatever it may be, eventually people will see that we're all part of the same team and we are being attacked on all sides.
But you're just arguing that needs to come through education as opposed to actual dispossession.
Ideally, yes, because...
Well, sure, ideally, but realistically,
it's possible that the vast majority of whites in America will need to get to that turning and breaking point in which we are, more blatantly being dispossessed. In a case like South Africa, it's different because the new president that was elected and the reigning political party in control. There are various ones. There's a kind of a guy running neo-communist party that's getting a lot of traction in South Africa, who's literally calling for the murder of whites. But the president himself that was just elected has said, verbatim things such as, we will take the white land, or that we will take the land away from the white farmers. And that is happening and has happened. And white-owned land has literally been appropriated from their owners without any kind of compensation. And
Right.
to add to that, in Australia, to their credit, they are taking a huge majority of those dispossessed farmers in as immigrants.
Are they really?
Yeah, and thus being labeled by.
I think they've only spoken of that. I don't know if they're actually doing that.
I thought I read that they were actually doing it.
I don't think that's. I think that's preliminary.
Preliminary. Well, I know that the black South African president has already referred to them as bigots.
Sure.
For wanting to do that.
They just spoke of it, that someone floated the idea in the Australian Parliament that that's what they should do. But there's no
I see.
There are no white refugees from South Africa. I guess it's just I feel like we're just sort of proving my point.
What, that it would require a disaster?
Well, there's that, but also the idea. I understand, Jack, that you hold out hope that increased dispossession will lead to whites. It will lead to some whites moving to the alt-right, but for the most part, my sense is that white people are sufficiently guilt-ridden that they're perfectly happy to be dispossessed and think that they should be dispossessed because we have wreaked havoc on the planet.
Are you suggesting the majority of whites feel that way?
Yes, I am.
No, and I agree with that point. Absolutely. But it seems like to me that because already, like, our last election, although not explicitly, was implicitly entirely race-based. Like, Donald Trump was a white candidate.
Right. Yeah. But he still only got a little over 50% of the white vote.
Yeah. I'm not arguing that we're in a good place right now, but
that's because of women.
Women still voted more for Trump if they were like white and married, I think,
right.
Or at least white.
Right.
Married.
But that
But men,
declining
white men, it was like close to 90.
It was not close to 90.
It wasn't 90, but
it was probably like 65 or something.
It was more than women for sure, but nonetheless.
All right. So so then if that is not the way forward, you think there's legitimate hope that just through grassroots type of, because I guess due to the numbers we constantly hear cited of the majority minority by 2040, I guess I've kind of viewed this as an inevitability. Are you saying that we could, like, through growing the movement now, reverse that, or that, like, how would that play out?
No, I'm not saying that. I am saying that although it's important to continue to, do what can be done and bring more people into the movement. In my opinion, I sort of hold a Guillaume Fay kind of view that it will take an economic collapse or a war or a combination or maybe a natural disaster to bring about a sufficient cause to enable a truly white pro-white political movement to gain any power.
Right.
That just in the current, if the current milieu continues, even with severe demographic decline, by 2040, whites are in the minority. And there's literally no way that a white male president would ever be elected again. That whites won't do anything about that, short of some kind of catastrophe. And arising from that kind of catastrophe, it's like a post, what Richard Spencer calls a post-American order. That's, it's probably, that's obviously black pilling, but that's how I see it. That, and then, that's not uncommon in terms of political movement. And there's no way to explain the rise of fascism in Europe without the desperation and so on of post-World War I society.
Certainly. And to clarify my position, I think I kind of see what you're saying now. And I wasn't trying to say that we're just going to reach a point where identity politics becomes so explicit. I guess I was kind of thinking that with the demographic shift, that type of a disaster is inevitable because our economy is not going to sustain itself as a first world economy in this type of futuristic state. Or at least a lean economy.
That's actually that's an excellent point, right? That once the demographic decline is so severe, right, there will be an inevitable economic collapse,
right?
Because there's just only so much. There's only so many people that whites can take care of. We're magicians, but we're not wizards.
By the way, to the credit of both of you, you were spot on with that statistic on white male voters. 63% of white males voted for Trump in the election. Sorry?
You were thinking of white nationalist men?
Only 10% of white nationalists.
Shocking.
I was actually thinking of the Negro vote.
Yeah.
Close to 90% of black men voted for Hillary.
And women were like 95 or something.
Yeah. Well, the 5% were the ones whose husbands, threatened to beat them if they didn't vote for Trump.
Sure. That actually does make sense in a pretty statistical manner. If 90% of the men voted for Trump and 95% of the women, I mean, half of black women are married? That works out. That's the 5%.
That's true. Did you say half of black men are married?
Black women. That's actually giving them too much credit. So my statistical analysis does not hold up.
I mean, I would say
half of black women have more than 8 children.
I would say 50% of Negro women are married, but they don't know who their husband is.
It's gotten bad in their communities.
It's a little bit like our family history.
Exactly.
You guys remember who's married to her?
People always talk about the black children that don't know who their fathers are, but they don't talk enough about the black women who don't know who their husbands are.
Right. That's right. This is creating a whole new social science, I think. I'm going to propose that we have an exit question and roll out of the podcast.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of excellent ground.
That's good. I actually have to get on to another podcast.
Well, we congratulate you.
Totally non-political, ironically enough.
Right, it's about spreadsheets.
Yeah, spreadsheet podcast.
With Jared Taylor.
Me and Jared are working on some side hustle.
You can promote something to challenge Excel.
Right. 1, 2, 3 or whatever.
Hegemony.
Yeah. Yeah, Jack, do you have an exit question?
I was reading that as Virgil having something exciting to throw at us.
No, I just.
All right, here's a good exit question. What year will America end, or this disaster occur that turns society on its head?
1965.
Well, you got the correct answer.
That's
And the correct answer was
the correct answer. I think is probably sooner than we expect. I think prior to 2040. I have to believe that enough whites will wake up for our movement to burst into the scene in a real, legitimate manner, providing an umbrella for all of the dispossessed whites and our future generations that are really being born into a country more and more that they are a minority in, and also, especially children born into conservative households that are simply forced to hold their tongue in ways that are, already very non-controversial for what we're talking about.
Yep, I agree more.
I don't have a date, but I would say...
you have to have a date. That's the idea of the exit question.
Okay. I'm going to go with 2025. And the reason for that is I think Trump will win re-election, all things being equal, in the coming 18 months or however long. But I don't, after he is served 2 terms, I think we'll get someone probably, most likely someone far worse than Hillary Clinton even.
Yeah, the overcorrection could be significant.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it will. I think that's just how politics work.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a seesaw.
Certainly. I'll give my answer and let Virgil close us out. So this might, off the cuff, sound optimistic, but I actually think this is very black-pilling. I think we can limp along for a very long time, and there's going to be some counter-movements like Trump, and there's going to be some, but we're basically going to live in this postmodern hell until 2060.
Wow, that does feel like a black pill trying to swallow it.
Yeah, I think that.
Honestly, I would rather swallow a blue pill if I'm giving. Give me the option of the two.
That's possible. I'm going to say, actually, seriously, in all seriousness, 2019.
Holy cow!
Wow, way to one up me.
Elaborate, please.
2019 is the year that we invade Iran and end up going to war with Russia.
Oh, Jesus.
And
unless Trump fires Bolton before that.
In the climate of nuclear war, our movement will finally gain ascendancy.
That's a very realistic answer.
All right.
Most of the leaders will die from radiation. But
let's pretend that Virgil didn't cut in with us already, and the correct answer was 1965. It's been a good show.
Thanks for tuning in.
Bye-bye.
bodies of their sons, they keep falling. The echoes from Mount Zion.